You expect your backyard to be the one place that feels truly private, an extension of home where a lawnmower's hum, a string of party lights, or the soft crackle of a fire pit are the only sounds that matter. I want you to hold that image for a second, because I'm about to tell you 3 true stories that happened in backyards, 3 ordinary nights that turned into the kind of close calls that rewrite how you think about the ground right behind your house. I'm not dramatizing. These are first-person accounts. I lived them. Some of the details are still brittle in my memory. The hiss of a zipper, the way pool lights cut through dark water, but they're all true. If anything I say feels vague on timelines or motives, that's because it was unclear then, and it remains unclear now. That uncertainty is part of what makes these feel so wrong. The first one happened when I was a kid, small enough that a Game Boy felt like a sacred object, and big enough to be expected to sleep in a tent because my brother wanted privacy from the rest of us. My older brother Scott had always been the kind who practiced things, setting up tents, building ramps out of scrap wood. He had this confidence that made me both admire and resent him. We were allowed to camp in the backyard that night because my parents thought a patch of open sky and a fire pit made for a harmless little adventure. There was a fire, marshmallow sticks, a plastic glow-in-the-dark toy somewhere, and 2 sleeping bags zipped side by side. My little brother stayed inside. He wasn't interested in tents. I remember clutching the Game Boy under my blanket until the batteries died, small green glow swallowed by sleep. At some point in the night I woke. The tent was a cocoon of canvas sounds, the rustle of fabric, the distant murmur of tires on the street, the faint smell of the fire pit. At first, everything seemed normal in that thick, dream-blurred way. Then I realized my brother Scott's sleeping bag beside me was empty. For a beat, one that stretched into impulsive, animal panic, I convinced myself he'd gone to the bathroom or wandered to the house to get more marshmallows. I unzipped the tent a little to peek out, thinking I'd catch him skulking back to the glow of the fire. There was a man sitting at the fire pit. He wasn't a silhouette at the edge of the light. He was there in the fire's glow, completely still, like someone who had been planted there to be watched. He was fully grown, older than my parents, and he didn't move as the tent zipper opened. What I remember most clearly is not his face, but the slow way the tent zipper crawled open from the outside. There was a tiny wedge of night where the tent flap separated, and an eye, just one, poked through that gap. It didn't blink in the clumsy way a startled stranger blinks. It watched. For a second, the zipper eased itself wider, like a hinge, revealing the suggestion of a smile without sound. Instinct replaced thought. I screamed. It came out like someone else's throat had borrowed my voice. The man fled. He slipped away through the dark between hedges and fence posts, and by the time my parents were awake and running out with flashlights and the smell of smoke from the dying fire pit, he was gone. The police were called. They drove up and down the block. They took notes and promised to follow up. We were told to sleep inside for a while. It felt almost too simple. The man had been there, and then he wasn't. No arrest. No neat closure. Just that open zipper, and the memory of being a small child inside a tent while someone who shouldn't have been there watched me from the firelight. Weeks later, at school during recess, I found the same man at the fence. My hands were still small and scarred from playing, my voice still capable of being smothered by a teacher's instruction. I was on the swings when he appeared on the other side of the chain link. He knew my name. He said it like he had rehearsed it inside his mouth. I didn't answer. I lied, stammered something about being late for class, and ran. It was the first time I felt the peculiar twist of being recognized by a stranger in a place that should have been anonymous. My parents tightened up. The rules changed. No more sleeping outside. My brother refused to stay over at friends' houses for a while. I started checking the windows at night, running my thumb along the seams of tent fabric at odd hours for the rest of the summer, like a ritual. Afterward, there was a new set of rhythms. How many locks were too many locks? Who answered the door where the flashlights lived? I didn't say I was scared as a performance. The fear didn't need to be spoken aloud to be present. At sleepovers years later, I found my attention slipping back to that zipper, to the way an eye can be both curious and predatory in one small aperture. I still wonder, did he know other kids? Had he done this before and then walked away into the night? We never found out. The police file on the incident ended in indefinido. That lack of resolution is its own kind of terror. You grow up, you learn to lock doors, and yet every handful of backyard grass could hold the memory of somebody who wasn't supposed to be there. If you're into true backyard horror and want to hear the other two, hit subscribe. There are two more that get even stranger. The next one felt less like a random trespass and more like something staged, rehearsed, as if someone had practiced being menacing until every detail fit into place. This one happened when I was older and attempting to navigate the tiny, terrifying ecology of buying used furniture online. It was a sunny afternoon and the listing was for a set of wooden chairs that looked like they belonged on a porch with ocean air. The seller's message was brief: meet at the house in the coastal neighborhood, back through the gate, use the side entrance. The homeowner was not around, so leave the cash and take the chairs. It felt at first like a straightforward transaction. The house itself looked unreal from the outside. Big windows, neat landscaping, gravel path that led past a yard that dropped off toward the beach. I remember the way the late sun gilded the siding, how distant gulls called like punctuation. There was a sticky note on the front door that read "Behind," pointing to a side gate. I waited at the path and called the number twice. Nothing. The street had a lazy, upscale quiet to it, the kind of hush that makes small noises seem louder. When I climbed the side path and looked through to the backyard, it was suddenly wrong. Every single window that I had seen closed from the front was now open. Not just one or two, but everyone. And in each darkened opening there was a person standing very still. They weren't gesturing. They were propped like mannequins, subtle differences in posture, but each one holding position like a human tableau. They were all facing me. Their mouths, when I could see them, were arranged into small, polite smiles, like people who had been coached on exactly how to look friendly. The effect was uncanny, surgical. I remember the sensation of my own pulse in my throat. At first I thought it was some kind of art installation or a quirky home staging. Then I noticed the car. A sedan parked half on the curb, its shine dulled by wind and salt. From a distance it looked familiar, like a Mercury Sable I'd seen used in movies as a vehicle of quiet menace. No one moved. I felt watched the way you feel watched when someone is looking directly at you and refuses to blink. My skin crawled. I backed away slowly, and when I turned to leave, someone stood on the porch. A figure was framed in the doorway, shadow cut against the open air, watching me get into my car. I found myself driving away with my hands white-knuckled on the wheel, because for the first time in a long while a backyard had set up a line of people between me and safety. I called a neighbor named Tom from the street. Tom was the kind of neighbor who knew everyone's comings and goings. He came outside, peered over the gate, and called the homeowner, Jim, on his phone. Tom spoke softly into his handset, and then looked at me with a kind of stunned apology. Jim was out of town, Tom said. The listing disappeared from the marketplace profile in the hours that followed. The seller's account went blank, like a face that had been scrubbed from an online page. We called the police. When they went to the house later, they found all the doors unlocked, the blinds closed again, and no car in the driveway. There was no sign of forced entry. There was only the impression of a rehearsal that might have had a much darker third act if I had stepped into the backyard alone and under the wrong assumption. What did those people want if not to scare someone off? Perhaps to mark that property as observed, to see who would show up when a stranger knocked on their weekend. Were they waiting for a transaction to lead to a vulnerability? I don't know. I can't say whether they would have handed the chairs to me with a smile and then asked me inside for a drink, or whether someone had been testing reactions. All I have are the photographs in my mind. The line of faces at the windows like a slow-motion flock, the stupidly ordinary sedan, and the abrupt microwave quick change from open windows to closed blinds. Whatever their intention, the feeling of being watched on private property stayed with me for weeks. You start to look at your own windows differently after something like that. What is it that you are showing to the world, and what might the people on the other side be rehearsing? That image of staged menace bleeds easily into the third story, because both of them exploit the same error. We think fences of glass and wood, are borders that will hold. The final one I'll tell you is the one that still wakes me in a way that feels physical. like the memory is a muscle that tenses without permission. This happened when I was hosting a backyard pool party in a house I was house-sitting for friends. There was a group of people, summer music faint in the background, strings of lights along the fence, and the kind of easy intimacy that makes you forget you are responsible for anyone but yourself. The woods behind the pool were a thin line of trees, more shadow than forest, and earlier that evening I had thought I heard someone cough out there, somewhere past the pool lights. I shrugged it off, told a friend about it as if it were an amusing detail, and went back to helping Mark set up the speaker. No one else seemed concerned. "We're usually okay," we said. The house had an alarm. The neighbors were close. The party wound down. People left. I remember cleaning up plates and watching the pool water catch the last of the light. I woke sometime around 2 in the morning to a sound that unspooled everything else, a splash. It was delicate at first, like a stone tossed into still water, but then it repeated, another splash, and the soft, unstoppable sound of someone swimming under the pool lights. The way water sounds at night is different, as if each ripple is recorded on a separate track, and you can hear the human intention in it. I crept to the bedroom's sliding glass door and peered through the blinds. There he was, a man moving rhythmically beneath the lights, slow and steady as if practiced. He swam to the steps and used them to climb out. Water streamed down his skin. He was dripping as he walked across the concrete toward the house, and his footsteps were silent against the pounding of my own heart. My feet found the lock on the bedroom door before my rational brain did. I locked it. I grabbed my phone and called 911. I made space between me and the door, like a place where I might be unreachable. When the intruder reached the sliding door, he paused and knocked, softly, then more insistent. He called out a name. It sounded like he thought he belonged there, like he was trying to reclaim something. I told the dispatcher on the line that someone was at the door and that I could see water on his clothes. I lied, told the caller I was on the phone with police, even though I could hear their escalating query about whether units were available. The man knocked again and said in a voice that tried to be familiar that he was one of the guests or someone you know, something like that. I kept the line open because the sound on the other end of a phone feels like a tether. He left. I heard the front door open and close. After a while the sirens came and police walked the yard. They found a wet trail up the concrete steps to my bedroom door, like a breadcrumb line that belonged in a horror film. One footprint after another, water pressed into concrete and then evaporating into the night air. There were no witnesses from the party who had stayed behind. Everyone had driven home. The only material evidence was that trail of water and a shaken group of people trying to explain why they hadn't stayed a minute longer. The police took statements. They found no one in the area, and in the log afterward the case file too ended in indefinido for where that man went or who he truly was. In the days that followed, my mind kept flipping back to the cough I had heard earlier that day, that tiny, meaningless sound at the tree line that I had folded into the soundscape like background noise. I built a mental map of how his steps must have fallen between the trees and the pool, where he might have pushed the patio door open if it had been unlocked, how thin the barrier was between a summer party and an invasion. The possibility that the earlier cough had been him reconnoitering the yard before the party arrived adds a hollow, gutting guilt to how I remember that night. Guilt that I had let the noise sit unremarked, that I had convinced myself small things didn't matter. So those are the three. A tent zipper and a single eye looking in at the wrong hour. A house with every window filled by smiling strangers who felt like actors in a very bad scene. A man in the pool who left a trail of wet footprints up to a bedroom door, each of them different in setup, similar in result. A moment where the border between private and public eroded so fast it felt like standing in the path of a wave. What connects them is not simply fear, but the way each incident exploited ordinary trust. The trust that a family campsite is safe. The trust that a buyer-seller exchange on a sunny afternoon is mundane. The trust that a backyard party will end in everyone going home intact. These stories expose a sliver of the world we prefer not to think about, the part where people without obvious motives breach the spaces we assume are ours. They don't always result in headlines or arrests. Sometimes they leave only a note on a door, an empty profile online, a wet trail up concrete. Those small unresolved traces lodge in you, and they change how you see your backyard. Not a sanctuary necessarily, but a threshold you know you must watch. After each of these nights I changed. The changes were small and domestic at first. Extra locks, drawing the blinds earlier, calling a neighbor to say I'm home. Later, they were internal. A habit of checking the corners of my property before letting down my guard, a reflexive measure of how safe any backyard could ever be. I carry a kind of map now in my head, where to run, where a shadow could hide, which windows can be seen from the street. That map is a low-level hum in the background of my life. It is not constant fear. It is a readiness honed by living close to the kind of moment that could become a catastrophe in a breath. I'll close with an image that won't let me go. The eye at the tent zipper. It's small, precise, and intimate in the worst way. It asks nothing and asks everything at once. Who are you? And how close can you allow a stranger to get without noticing? Backyards are supposed to be where we lower our guard. These stories are my warning. Sometimes the danger is as simple as someone standing where they don't belong and waiting for the precise slow motion of you moving past the wrong boundary. If any of this strikes a chord, if you've had a backyard moment that unsettled you as much as these unsettled me, share it in the comments. I read them, and other people do too. The best way we process these things is by remembering we're not alone in noticing how thin the line between safe and unsafe can be. If you want more real-life stories about ordinary places turning dangerous, subscribe and I'll keep bringing them.